This is something a little bit out of the ordinary for me. Well, it's not that much out of the ordinary seeing as it's an arcade racer. But it's a new game for old hardware, and it's such a particularly impressive looking new game for old hardware, I thought it warranted a special mention on my YouTube channel. Faster is a brand new 1980s style arcade racer for the Atari STE, developed by a guy called Jonathan Thomas, that's been built from the ground up using modern tools, techniques and knowledge to create a super fast racing experience. I think I first became aware of this project through Twitter, and it immediately caught my eye because the very first time I saw it running, I thought it was an actual arcade game from the 1980s that I'd just never heard of, rather than something running on an old home system. Growing up as a teenager in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I never had any exposure at all to the Atari ST. Most of my friends had either Sega Master Systems or Mega Drives, or, in one instance, an Amiga. And when I think about what the Atari ST could do in terms of racing games, my mind usually defaults to the woefully piss-poor port of Outrun, with its inept recreation of the Ferrari Testarossa, janky-ass frame rate and generally drab colour palette. Now, something I've only fairly recently become aware of is that both the Amiga and Atari ST didn't just come in one flavour, and actually had several later, more powerful revisions. This is running on the Atari STE rather than the standard ST, which boasted a much larger colour palette and improvements to the multimedia hardware, as well as better sound and upgradable RAM. I'll put my hands up here and admit, I'm pretty clueless about just how much more these extra hardware improvements on the Atari STE compared to something like the hardware of a Mega Drive or Super Nintendo, but seeing what Jonathan has achieved here visually with a contemporary 16-bit home computer really blew my socks off. While Faster lacks the huge trackside scenery or undulating hills and dips of, say, Outrun or Chase HQ, the big thing here that makes this look so impressive and arcade-like to me is the speed that it's running at, an incredibly impressive 50 frames per second. To put this into context, the original arcade version of Outrun ran at 30 frames per second. The original 1985 arcade version of Hang On didn't have any hills and concentrated instead on blisteringly fast gameplay, swerving left and right in and out of the enemy bikes. The Sega Master System port of it, the game that was actually built into my 8-bit Sega console, also followed suit, and I can remember as a kid being highly impressed with just what a great sensation of speed it conveyed. When the Master System got its own port of Outrun some time later, and all the undulating roads were added back in, I always thought that the compromise for it seemed to just be a little bit of extra noticeable chugginess in the scrolling compared to its bike-based sibling. Slightly chuggy looking frame rates was something that were quite common in a lot of its older 16-bit Brothers arcade ports too. That loss of smoothness in the frame rate was something I was always aware of as a kid that would differentiate a home game compared to an arcade game, but as a 12-year-old with no concept of what frames per second were, I didn't actually realise what it was that I was seeing that made these games look so different. The point I'm labouring away at here is that by not overcomplicating the track with hills and giant roadside sprites, by instead focusing on a super fast and silky smooth frame rate, this is what, to my eye, elevates this game to something that looks more like something you'd have seen in an actual 80s arcade. One other nice arcade-like effect the game also has is a full 24-hour day-to-night cycle. The game's download page also mentions that it's got 15 plus large full-colour sprites on the screen, drawn by Blitterchip, 30 plus colours on screen from the enhanced STE palette, as well as simultaneous digital engine noise sound effects and a YM soundtrack, and a screen shaking effect courtesy of the STE hardware scrolling. So it looks great, but how does it play? Now, I don't own an Atari STE, but after a bit of faffing about, I was able to get the game running in an Atari ST emulator called Atari, which can also emulate the STE, and was able to play the game using my Xbox 360 pad. Now, I keep referring to Outrun here as my main point of reference, But actually, the old school arcade racer this looks the most like is Konami's WEC Le Mans from 1986. I always used to just call it WEC Le Mans as a kid in my head, and that's what I'm going to keep referring to it as now. The last time I tried playing it was on a mini arcade racer main cabinet I'd converted from a racing game toy, and that game is hard. I mean, I think I was making it harder on myself in that particular video that you can see here, as I was playing it with a digital wheel rather than proper analog controls. And much like its Konami inspiration, Faster is actually quite hard. In my early attempts at playing the game, I was flying off the track at pretty much every corner. This is something though that Jonathan has actually acknowledged on his own YouTube channel, where he mentions that some of the commentary around Faster suggests that it's somehow too fast or unfair. But he goes on to state, Faster becomes much easier to play once you practice a lot, and apply some techniques to enhance your game, and that this is exactly how racing games were like in the 80s, basically designed to be difficult so that they would eat as many coins as possible. He's not wrong. He also goes on to provide some tips to improve your performance, as well as providing a video demonstration. I felt I improved a bit after a few goes, but it's safe to say I still suck at the game. I felt a bit like the centrifugal force of a corner was still trying to pull me off the track, even if I was just trying to take it really slowly. I must admit that my personal preference to the way a retro racer like this handles is something a bit more like Hang On, Outrun or Chase HQ, where if you go into the corner too fast, you start to get a skidding type animation as you rapidly veer off towards the edge of the track, and you normally get a nanosecond to react by either coming off the accelerator for a brief period or hitting the brake. But as I said though, this is just my personal preference. I can definitely recall playing old school arcade racers back in the day that didn't have that outrun style handling, like the aforementioned WEC Le Mans, and also Tato's Continental Circus. And I really don't want to detract in any way from just what an incredible job Jonathan's done here, building a brand new arcade racer that looks this good on such old hardware. So anyway, that's my brief look at Faster on the Atari STE. An amazing looking new game on old hardware that genuinely wouldn't have looked out of place in a 1980s arcade. Oh, and just as a final point of interest, as I was looking up videos about Outrun on the Atari ST for this video, I actually found out that someone made a new port of Outrun for the Atari STE in 2019, and wow, it really does look like such a massive improvement. This is a really excellent job. I think I'm going to have to try and track down a copy of this myself. Do check out the full version of this video. I'll put a link to it in the description. They've actually done a much better job here of replicating the original colour scheme of the original arcade game, something which actually the Mega Drive version didn't do a very good job of originally, but the Mega Drive version itself has had a hack done, which actually makes it look much closer to the original arcade game. Anyway, getting completely off topic here, and I've done a separate video all about the Mega Drive arcade colours. So, time to wrap the video up there. I have been Mr. Thundering. Take care everybody, and I will see you for the next video. Cheerio!